Okay. Good evening, everyone. Let's try one more time. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Thank you. Thank you for staying with us till the very, very end. We really appreciate everyone's time, consideration, and passion. I'm delighted to be here. It's a privilege and an honor. Thank you to Dr. Fred and his team, and congratulations on an immensely successful conference. I think what we're doing today is actually a pretty great continuation of what we've been talking about throughout the afternoon. So we'll frame this as a continuation of the previous speakers and panels and not a standalone by any means. Perfect. So thank you for the gracious introduction. We can skip this slide. But we chuckled earlier today when we were talking about this, as it's been framed as a panel with two speakers. So, despite us being a little crunched for time and wanting to be sensitive to everyone's schedules here, we'd like to invite this group to be our third panelist. So we are very much interested in hearing from folks in terms of their experiences in connecting research and policy. And my colleague and friend Timothy is going to just talk us through very quickly what we'll be covering.
Okay, thank you, Dan. So our intention is to try to expose you to the whole idea of policy. Many times, when we talk about policy, it sounds something so abstract, and our objective is to try to make sure that we try to give it meaning. And so we're going to be looking at why should we actually focus on policy, why is policy important. We'll be trying to understand what are the processes in developing policy, and where can we infuse, therefore, the research that we're doing to influence this policy. We'll be looking at the impact of policy, looking at aspects of lobbying and advocacy, and depending on your energy levels, and we'll be looking at then the concepts around policy practice. What are the challenges and opportunities, and what can we take away as next steps? That is what we intend to share. So moving on to the whole, to why policy. I think first of all, when we talk about policy, I would, in a very simple way, say that policy refers to national frameworks, especially when we're talking about public policy, that guide the actions or interventions of government within a specific geographical area, in this case a country. And the reason why policy then becomes important is because it therefore is supposed to be the driver for change at community level. It is what is supposed to create the social change or any other change that we're trying to see at the community level. Policy is also important because it's also helping us in building partnerships. It helps us address some of the issues, the underlying issues within the communities, and creating the link between those in power and those at community level. And then we also see that researchers therefore are uniquely positioned because of the evidence that we generate to be able to inform policy.
So in addition to why policy, we did want to take what can be a really abstract concept and really bring it to light to people, especially after 2 days of hearing about and learning about some incredible and rigorous research, which can be very much in the weeds and complex. So when we talk about policy, we like to think about policy as being, that it occurs at the seamless intersection of research and storytelling. So for our friends and colleagues who were in the room yesterday and were able to hear from some of our local and national government officials, if you were paying close attention, the officials were going back and forth between using statistics and data and storytelling consistently throughout their talks. It's an art form, actually, really. And it's something that, I think in all of our work and all of our lives is something that we can strive to be really effective and efficient at. One distinction between effective policy work and effective research is that effective policy work, when presented, is very short and simple, clear and straightforward. I think we have a little bit of time, and I know folks have been doing a lot of listening, so we're going to do a very, very brief brief activity with everyone. So we just ask that you turn to the person next to you and take 2 minutes, and we'll be timing because we're on a time budget, and answer 3 very simple questions. Who are you? Why are you here? And what drives you to do the work that you do? Who are you? Why are you here? And what drives you to do the work you do? If you haven't yet, please switch to the second person. Thank you. Okay, and let's come back. Apologies if it wasn't a full 2 minutes, but it looks like a lot of people have wrapped up already. So while we don't have time to do a full debrief as a large group, we'd ask that you just maybe take a moment and just think about what that experience was like. Was it easy? Do you like talking about yourself? Oh yeah, I hear. Was it really difficult? Did you find yourself meandering with your words and kind of bouncing around all over the place? So yes, 100%. So in our work, whether it's research, policy, to think about yourself as a storyteller and to think about telling your own story and why you come to the work that you do. Whether you're at a research table or a policy table with colleagues or government officials, one of your most effective tools is your own story. It also helps when you're working with groups that might not be as familiar to you to help to identify with them and for them to identify with you as to what's bringing you to the policy table. So thank you for indulging us in the brief activity. The follow-up to the brief activity is just to say, the reason that we're here in front of everyone today and engaging around this topic is because the world is in need of policy leadership and expertise. Too often, our policy conversations are driven and led by ideology and values, which is an important component of any policy discussion, to be sure, but it's seriously lacking in fact and evidence. And we'll go through in just a few moments a couple of examples of what the difference between ideologically driven policy and fact and research driven policy are. Mm-hmm. We also just wanted to highlight a couple of skills because we know that in this room there are a range of experiences, a range of generations, and just so if you're not sure exactly what policy skills or capacities are, we'd refer you to this brief list. So just to summarize, leadership, real-world experience, subject matter expertise. And when we say expertise, we don't necessarily mean that you're winning the Nobel Prize, but that you're committed and passionate about an issue and you can help with other people to facilitate a conversation around that issue that you care so much about, grounded in, of course, research and your own story. And then, of course, very much the ability to connect with communities. Policy is only made possible because of the communities driving policy change and that are very much impacted by the impacts of policy. So just as a brief example, we wanted to highlight from a United States perspective in Missouri, one of our local elected officials, and also an alum of the Brown School at Washington University, Representative Cora Faith Walker, who says, "I look at facts and evidence, numbers and statistics, and make arguments based on what seems like the most sound policy decision." To bring it back here to Uganda, again, we heard yesterday from multiple government officials about the very real challenges that are faced at the local level. Sending children to school, building schools, building hospitals, making sure that healthcare is accessible. And again, they have the exact same need for statistics and research to help to drive the decision-making and allocation of what sounds like very finite budget and funding, both in the US as well as in Uganda.
So, you know, who therefore really leads policy? And this varies. In our context here in Uganda, not much research is actually driving policy as much as it should be. There's an improvement in the last couple of years, but ideally, you know, policies must be even evidence-driven. I like what Dr. Mugisha said earlier. The tension, for example, between, you know, existing policies and cultural context. And so think tanks, research centers, just like ICHAD and many other research centers, should actually be at the helm of driving policy and leading policy discussions, because it should be hinged and based on evidence. You know, advocacy by non-profit organizations, advocacy by communities, advocacy should also be a driver or leader to shape policy, because policy should be based on the voices of the people. Policy should be based and address the needs of the people. Then obviously what is really the reverse in our situation is the elected officials. They have the responsibility of designing and leading policy, and that is part of their responsibility, and therefore they are leaders in policy formulation.
So we promised an example of ideology versus ideology and value-driven policy versus facts and evidence-driven policy. So here's something, a statement that's resonant clearly from the presentations and discussions so far. We must invest in early childhood education and development supports because, number one, our children are the future and among our most vulnerable. So an ideological or a values-driven statement. Now compare that with statement number two. 85% of brain development occurs in the first 3 years. And number three. And again, from a US context, for every $1 that's invested during early childhood, it results in a return on investment of as much as $8. So if the US government spends $1,000 per student on pre-K or universal pre-kindergarten, that results in an $8,000 savings down the road. So taken alone, each of those statements are okay. But when you put them all together, I think they make a much more compelling case when you're combining both the ideology and the value statement, along with actual research and statistics to help bring people along and to paint the picture of what might be possible or useful to address a problem or an issue. Without going too far into depth in the policy cycle, so we wanted to just demonstrate the policy cycle, especially, you know, with a nod to our research colleagues in the room, because the idea of policy is that it can appear to be very messy and convoluted, but in fact it oftentimes follows a pretty distinct and specific path. So I don't know, Timothy, if you wanted to talk to me.
Yeah. So I mean, when we are going through the cycle, I think what is critical for us to note is we need to be able to be clear on what are we trying to address, what is the problem, and that's the starting point, and then you move to the analysis and making analysis of this problem, and that influences the process of policy development, and then the elements of policy enactment, which involve advocacy as a critical part of that process. And then we have the implementation of the policy. This is pretty standard, looking at how this policy is actually impacting on the communities that it's intended to or intended for. And an evaluation of these policies. Are they working? Are they not working? What must change? What must be updated? And then, you know, based on that, it's a continuous cycle.
That's right. And just one other note about the policy cycle, and one of the reasons we wanted to share this slide in particular with this group, is there are opportunities at each one of these stages to be involved. So even if working, in programs isn't your forte or isn't your area of interest, you can work on the advocacy side and the advocacy side or the policy development side if you're particularly fond of analysis. So we have a little section here giving both some foundational groundwork as well as some examples specific to Timothy's work on engaging elected officials and government officials. And we wanted to talk through, no coincidence there. So in terms of talking to government officials and elected officials, there's one important concept that, as Timothy and I have been talking about this panel, kind of rang true for both of us, and it's a distinction between lobbying and advocacy. And so just in a nutshell, there's a lot of similarities between the two, and we'll cut right to the chase so people aren't on the edges of their chairs. But what we will say about these two things is lobbying is, in essence, working on a specific law or a specific bill or piece of legislation with a lawmaker and trying to impact its outcome. So an advocacy is much more, it can be much more broad, and it's more based around looking at a specific issue. Going back to our early childhood example, it could say, excuse me, governor, or excuse me, mayor, I really think we need to pass this bill, or you should sign this bill into law, the specific bill that would increase funding for early childhood education by $10 million. Yeah. Versus, from an advocacy lens, excuse me, Mrs. Mayor, what we would really like to see is increased supports for our children. As we've discussed already, they are our future, and 85% of brain development happens before the age of 3. So it's a subtle distinction, but especially if you're doing work with a nonprofit or an NGO, there are oftentimes some rules and restrictions around what organizations can and can't do. So it's not to spook anybody, but it's just to say that the distinction matters as you get more and more into your policy work.
Yeah, and maybe just to add, just to in our case, I'll give an example. In Uganda, they the now amended Children's Act 2016 involved a lot of lobbying, where we were very specific about amendments we wanted in the Children's Act, and so we did engage in lots and lots of lobbying, yet at the same time we have been doing a lot of general advocacy around increased resource allocation to issues of child protection and about different aspects around child abuse. But we have had that experience of the Children's Act, but I also recently had the opportunity to see firsthand what happens in the US government, where I think probably there is no place in the world where lobbying is more done than in the US. In April this year, we went to lobby the senators at Capitol Hill, and we were actually asking them not to pass legislation that would lead to 30% cut of the aid budget to developing countries, because President Trump had proposed a 30% reduction in aid, and we had to go to speak to the different senators and say, this is what aid is doing, and if you cut this aid, this is what is going to happen. So that's just a bit of an example. Mm-hmm. And
so just to kind of tie it all together, because when we talk about lobbying versus advocacy, what oftentimes gets left out of the picture is policymaker and stakeholder education. And so even if advocating publicly as an individual organization isn't your forte, if it's not what really gets you excited, sharing your work and again sharing your story is a powerful tool. And even if you're not, participating in the rally on the steps of, City Hall or whatever it might be, or signing a petition or engaging in other ways, when you're doing good work, it's not uncommon in terms of building relationships with government officials for that work to be heard about and for you to be invited, to speak about it. either informally in a meeting setting as elected officials are looking to craft legislation, or formally in the form of a legislative hearing. So those are experiences that I think can be really powerful for moving the conversation around the crafting of legislation and its implementation. And then just the quick follow-up on who to target. So if you're sitting there and you've never met with a government official or an elected official, that's okay. That's perfectly fine. It's actually not a very common thing. When people are asked what forms of engagement they participate in, meeting with their elected officials, one-on-one or in small groups, is at or towards the bottom of the list. We also know from research that it's one of the most effective ways of impacting and informing policy. And so we want to try to demystify and make it feel a little more accessible to everybody. So who would you target? And it's just something to give a bit of pause and thought to. If it's a policy that is created at the local level, you'd obviously want to work with your local or city administrators. If it's a national policy, you would do, similar to Timothy, and work with senators or representatives. And then also, we were talking earlier about that experience in DC, and it's no surprise that the senators that they were meeting with sit on the committee that decides the budget. So there's a level of just doing a little bit of homework in terms of who your representatives are, what their interests are, and who and what they might resonate. So your time and your energies are as well spent as possible. So while I was not with Timothy in Washington, D.C., I've also done a bit of travel to Washington, D.C. and teaching courses with my friend and colleague Tammy Orahood, who's also here from the Brown School. But so we also just wanted to show a picture. I don't know if people can see it, but all of the students are making funny faces because we just also want to share that policy can be hard and serious business, but it can also be a wonderful way of bringing people together and quite joyful. So we wanted to share some just overarching concepts of what successful engagement with policymakers can look like. So again, coming back to your own story, making a connection with a policymaker, localizing whatever it is that you're talking about. So for example, elected officials are elected by constituents, and so their constituent issues are who they're most concerned with. So if you're meeting with somebody who represents a certain neighborhood or a certain district, finding a way to connect your work specifically to that district, whether it's anecdotal or research driven if possible, is a major way of currying favor with them. And then again, just you figure that out by doing your homework, by doing research and understanding about who the policymaker is, what their interests are, what their committee assignments may or may not be. You can look on their websites if they have websites. You can do look back at old newspaper articles. Maybe they gave a quote, that kind of tips their hat onto what really excites them. And then, of course, making clear connections between problem and policy solutions. We'll talk a little bit about some different models of policy analysis, and briefly, I know people are starting to get hungry, but the idea that policy analysis, policy work typically starts with problem identification. Diagnosing a problem is not enough in the policy sphere, but to come with ideas, no matter how specific or how broad, and how to address it is a great way to have an impact. And then, of course, some kind of handout or takeaway, whether that's your email address and a few pieces of information on a piece of paper, or if you have access to an organization such as the ChildFund or Smart Africa, information about an organization that you're doing work with, in different capacities, so they have something to remind you about the engagement. And then, of course, practice, practice, practice. There's no shortage of practice that you can have before stepping into a meeting with an elected official. Sometimes you might have 5 minutes, sometimes it might be 30 minutes, and we strongly suggest if you do have a meeting or an opportunity to connect with an elected official, whether it's in a formal private meeting or even in passing at a conference, that you come in with a direct idea and a clear idea of what it is exactly that you're hoping to say and connect around, and then a possible goal and outcome. Last but not least, following up. So elected officials and government officials, you are their constituents. They want to hear from you. They're also very, very busy, as evidenced by some of the changing schedules with our conferences. So it's not a knock on them by any means. They have a lot of responsibilities, a lot of duties, and so you're not being rude or out of hand by politely following up and nudging if they've said that they would do something or get back to you, and there hasn't been progress made. So without spending too much time on this again, if you haven't had a meeting with an elected official, in short, it looks like, a pretty typical meeting, like coffee with a friend or tea with a friend. Although, you're going in with a specific objective, so a very objective forward coffee or tea with a friend. Again, the only thing that we'd really say here, that we haven't really covered already, is to think about the person sitting across the table from you as just another person. I know that there's an incredible amount of respect that our elected officials and government officials deserve and are due. But at the same time, they want to hear from you. And so finding a way to kind of navigate being deferential and respectful while also still, making your points clear. I think Dr. Akande made this a point earlier in his talk and how he's gotten to where he is, which is to be, respectfully disruptive. I believe were the words he used. So I think that's something that we can all channel in our work, in our lives.
Yeah, so I think one of the areas we want to share also is around the area of community-driven research and programs, and how this can fuse together to actually address policy. Many times we're out in the community, we're doing work in the community, and we're identifying a number of issues within the community, and these issues therefore should help us really build that evidence base that we need to be able to engage with the policymakers. He just talked about some of the things that we must consider, or what a meeting looks like, and one of the bullet points there really says, having very clear messages and making our ask known, and it's stronger when we have the voices from the communities. I gave an example in my earlier presentation of children from Kitgum going to parliament, and it's stronger when the parliamentarians are listening to the voices of children themselves, because it is more authentic. And so we are able to then use that as evidence to influence policy. And so bringing these stories and then bringing facts to beef this up, and figures, which is really the evidence that we try to generate from research, can help inform policy.
I apologize. This slide animates, and we're going to skip it. So if we can click through it just a little bit. The takeaway as it animates is that there are a number of models of policy analysis. One popular way of doing policy analysis is a tool called Google or the internet, and just searching around. But without going into too much depth on two example models, we would just say there are a number of models of policy analysis out in the world, and each has distinct characteristics and advantages and disadvantages. It's for another training or workshop another day. But we would encourage folks in your work to identify and be open to these. We find that it can be a really helpful framework for trying to narrow and target your focus in what can be a really unwieldy search process to gather facts and information. One thing about the localizing component, and then we'll go ahead to opportunities and challenges, next steps, and a closing. So we still have a little bit of a ways to go. But so the idea behind localizing information, again, so with our early childhood example, there's been amazing information presented here at this conference on some policy brief fact sheets put together by Smart Africa Center and partners, with statistics and numbers about the demographics of children in Uganda, and the very real difficulties and challenges that they face. So again, just to tie it all together, and we couldn't emphasize enough just how critical localizing your policy work can be. And as we flip through, there are the beautiful policy briefs, a 3-part series of one-pagers. Again, would just highlight briefly that for being one page of information, the researchers are able to fit 20 citations onto one page. I know we're all trained typically in our academic and school environments to oftentimes write for length. You know, you get an assignment to write 10-page research paper, 20-page research paper. I'm looking at Tyrone and thinking about his latest paper and thinking about how many pages that might have been. The challenge with policy, again, is to really distill it into simple, clear, concise messages, but not to lose the rigidity or the rigorousness of the research that's going into it.
And without doubt, there are challenges in trying to influence policy. I think one of the areas we are trying to bridge is the relationship between, you know, researchers and policymakers. We are continuing to help and try to bridge that gap because, you know, many times both groups speak different languages, and so that lack of the relationship has been a challenge, and it's something that we're trying to bridge. The other issue is that, you know, you have elected officials for a specific period of time. So when you have converted one group, then they're not elected again, so you have to start from scratch again. The turnover, sometimes you have champions, you have people who understand your cause and what you're trying to influence, and they're not back in office. So that definitely is also a challenge. And obviously the politics that influences a lot of what is going on. Many times your views, your opinions are overshadowed by the politics of the day, and that's a reality. But there are also opportunities.
And the opportunities are great. And I know, again, this room is full of passionate, dedicated, brilliant people. And policy might not be what everyone wakes up in the morning thinking about, and that's okay. But what we'd encourage in terms of the opportunities that exist are to actually take a look at what some possible next steps might be. And so if you're brand new to policy and it's not something that you've really thought about before, we'd encourage you just to be open to it. We've done a lot of great problem identification today and yesterday in defining some of the obstacles and barriers that, you know, our communities face. And policy is a very real way of affecting change and improving the lives of the people that we care about. If you are a little more experienced in the research and policy field, think a little bit more about the specific skills or opportunities or the networks that you can build based on your work and your interests, specifically to have a greater impact in the policy area. And so part of that is, you know, a couple of ideas, and we also always suggest to have a time frame for ideas and to use a small wins model. So of course we're all working to, you know, end global hunger or poverty or the HIV/AIDS epidemic, but instead of starting with that as the goal, identify the goals that build up to achieving that goal and who you need to work with and what you need to do to get there. So we offered a couple of ideas, you know, meeting with colleagues and community groups to develop an policy agenda, engaging with a single elected official or government official if it's not an experience that you've had. And you can do that on your own. You can do that with friends or colleagues. You could reach out to an amazing organization like the one that Timothy and Simba represent and see if there are opportunities for you to get involved to share your story with policymakers. And when we talk about setting goals, last but certainly not least, to refer back to our esteemed Dr. Fred, we will take what we learn to Parliament and improve children's behavioral health. So again, thanks to Dr. Fred for a fantastic conference and convening. And I think we all have our charge for the work that we've been discussing here and moving forward in terms of its importance and also very much the impact that it can have.
Thank you very much, Dan and Timothy, for really taking us through this very important topic in a very clear way, although you are really time stressed and we all are very hungry. They acknowledge that and they really went at it very well. So I think we still must have a few questions, although we are hungry. So let's have like 2 or 3 questions, and then let the questions be very clear, precise, and to the point. We don't tell a story now, just ask a question. So let's start with the gentleman in blue.
Wow, thank you so much. I'm more than impressed for the way you detail the policy issues. But I just want to find out, with regards to policy, what is the difference between lobbying and then advocacy? Thank you.
Okay, let's pick the next question, and then after that you can answer them.
Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. I've done research for so many years, but I think it's still a thankless job. I don't know your experience, and I always ask myself, are politicians interested? Politicians, well, are policymakers, are they interested in evidence? We've been lucky that we've had a lot of funding where they've been involved from conception to the end. But at the end of the day, they go with what will give them votes. I can give you a simple example. I got a grant from Grand Challenges Canada and NIH, implemented it in post-conflict northern Uganda, and demonstrated to them with a small dose of epilepsy, a small dose of pharmacology and psychotherapy, we are able to stabilize children. And also people that were traumatized. I recruited nurses and what. We worked together in the whole process. The moment the project ended, everything ended. Even my nurses were chased from the district. And even the money for the drugs was diverted to. Do they want evidence? We've met over policy briefs over and over and over and over. I don't know what language we've not used. And we've said, please, give priority to mental health. Nurses are being recruited, clinic officers, but they are all diverted to malaria, HIV. So what, do they like evidence?
Okay, thank you very much. Let's get the last question. The gentleman, I think there was somebody else here, in between. That. Was there anybody else? Anybody else? Okay, last question.
I tend to see a disconnect in many cases between the intellectual level of the researchers, the knowledge. They are all PhD fellows, but the politicians are just senior six leavers. You know, explaining this to them is a big problem, because you are in research in this social work, but I know about other researchers in agriculture, National Agricultural Research Organization. They have come up with important discoveries about the diseases that are killing off Uganda's food crops. They are all PhD men, very highly educated. They have explained to the members of parliament that genetic modification of crops is not dangerous, environmentally or health-wise, but nobody is listening. So I tend to think that even you people, we researchers have got to find a way of actually simply explaining their findings to these rather inferiorly educated people.
Okay, I think that's it. No gender balance. That's still okay. We don't have so much time, so yeah. I let you decide who answers.
Okay. Yeah, I'll just go with the last comment, which speaks to the challenges I mentioned. And I say that one of the issues is that, you know, your researchers and policymakers speak different languages, and that's exactly what you're saying. And I think the task is how do we package our information in the simplest way for the policymakers to actually understand, and I think that's a task that we have. But then also the other, I think, question that Dr. Mugisha asked, do they want evidence? And that's a tough question to answer based on the experiences that we have. Because, you know, in many of what we call developed countries, policy and strategic direction is driven by research. It's built on very strong ideologies that, and theoretical grounds that are evidence-driven. And that is something that we have to educate ourselves. When I say ourselves, I'm talking about each and every one. I'm talking about the policymakers, the communities, that it is important. We cannot continue to make ad hoc decisions. Policy is important. And why policy is important? Because what we see working or not working is basically a reflection of the policies that are in place. And so it is important that these are driven by evidence. And Dr. Mugisha, I think we cannot give up, we cannot fold hands. I think we just have to keep pounding this message home that evidence must drive policy.
I would just briefly echo that, say how much I appreciate and agree with our three questions and the context that was provided with them. Working in policy is not easy, and it would be disingenuous of Timothy and I to say otherwise. But again, it's about chipping away. It's about small wins. It's about, you know, picking an issue in an area, understanding the ideology that drives the different sides behind it, and then building a research base to the third question's, the gentleman's point, and communicating it in a way that is effective, efficient, even exciting. And just for a little bit of context, ideologically driven policy absolutely still happens in developed countries. There might be a level more of evidence-based that gets incorporated into some policy, but it's something that we're actively working around in the US, as well as what it sounds like in Uganda as well. So I would just thank everybody again for your time and energy, and I know Timothy and I can stick around for a little bit longer if people have follow-up questions as well. Thanks again, and enjoy the rest of the evening.